During the darkness of World War I, amidst battlefields echoing with trenches and explosions, a young messenger, Edward Carter, risked his life to deliver a crucial message. Edward had been ordered to cross enemy lines and deliver the message to headquarters. This message had the potential to change the course of the war, but the task was far from easy. Traversing through enemy territories, dangerous borders, and collapsing trenches, this journey was a grueling test of resolve. It was nighttime, and the fog had engulfed everything. Edward tightened his coat and stood at the edge of the trench, receiving instructions from his officer. The officer placed a reassuring hand on Edward's shoulder and said, "Carter, this message is of utmost importance. Our hopes are pinned on you. Return successful, but make sure the message gets through no matter what." Edward nodded and silently prayed to accomplish the mission. As soon as he stepped out of the trench, the sound of gunfire filled the air. The enemy soldiers were vigilant, keenly observing for any movement. Edward lay flat on the ground and began crawling. His breaths were rapid, but his determination was unshakable. Every step of the way, death loomed large. The ground was strewn with bodies and craters from explosions. Edward tried to ignore the ghastly sights, focusing solely on his goal. At one point, he approached a collapsing trench where a wounded soldier was groaning. Edward hesitated but reminded himself of the importance of the message. With a heavy heart, he moved forward. As he navigated through the fog, Edward spotted an enemy outpost. Quickly hiding behind some bushes, he studied their routines. The enemy was alert, but a fleeting moment of negligence gave Edward the opportunity to advance. Crawling stealthily towards the outpost, he found a safe path. Each movement made his heart race with the fear of being discovered. After passing the outpost, Edward reached an open field. Here, there was no place to hide, making it the most dangerous stretch. He quickened his pace, but an enemy marksman soon spotted him. Bullets struck the ground around him as Edward ran and took cover in a crater. Panting heavily, he knew that stopping meant certain death. After catching his breath, Edward devised a diversion. He fired his pistol towards the enemy to distract them and then dashed in the opposite direction. It was a risky maneuver, but it worked. The enemy's attention diverted, allowing Edward to hide behind a nearby bush. In the early hours of the night, Edward reached a desolate village. The ruins bore testimony to the devastation of war. The silence was eerie, amplifying his unease. Seeking shelter, Edward entered a shattered house and rested briefly. He sipped water from a bottle in his pocket, his hands trembling but his resolve intact. The mission was far from over. As he left the village, he noticed small footprints in the mud, children's footprints. He was astonished that anyone could survive in such dire circumstances. Moving forward, he encountered an elderly woman rummaging through the debris. She saw Edward and froze in fear. Raising his hands to show he meant no harm, Edward reassured her. The woman offered him water and said, "May God protect you." This brief encounter rekindled a spark of hope in Edward, a reminder that humanity could endure even amidst war. The next few hours were even more perilous. Despite the fog, the risks of enemy patrols increased. Edward exercised extreme caution, but a sudden encounter with an enemy soldier turned deadly. As Edward fled, a bullet grazed his arm, knocking him to the ground. Wincing in pain, he refused to give up. Binding his wound with a piece of cloth, he stumbled forward. Traveling with an injury was excruciating, but Edward's determination carried him through. Finally, before dawn, he neared his headquarters. However, one last obstacle awaited him. The enemy had mined the area. Edward had to tread carefully, knowing a single misstep could doom his mission. As he approached the final steps, Edward's heart pounded fiercely. He knocked on the headquarters door, and a soldier quickly pulled him inside. Exhausted, Edward handed the message to the officer. Reading the message, the officer embraced Edward and said, "Carter, you have upheld our trust." For the first time, Edward felt the weight of his accomplishment. For Edward, this journey was not just a wartime mission but a transformative experience. He learned that war was not merely about weapons but also about determination, sacrifice, and humanity. After the war ended, Edward made this message a cornerstone of his life, striving to teach the world that the true battle is not just survival but preserving humanity.